The sun hung low in the sky, painting the frontier world in gold and orange. Dust rose in soft swirls around the legs of a lone horse, snorting and stamping near a wooden barn that looked older than the town it stood next to. The barn's wood was cracked and worn, but it had a strange solidity that no simple carpenter could explain. Inside, shadows moved gently, shifting with the rhythm of something alive, though no living creature was visible. Jacob Kane, the cowboy, wiped his hands on his worn coat and leaned against the barn's doorway. He had lived on this planet longer than most settlers could remember, though officially, records showed he had arrived just a decade ago. He didn't care much for paperwork or formalities. He cared for his barn, his horse, and the work inside that no one else seemed to understand. From the distance, a group of figures appeared, moving in unison. 5 women, identical in appearance, stepped lightly across the dusty plains. Their boots made almost no sound, and yet, there was a presence about them that made Jacob instinctively straighten. These were not ordinary travelers. They were known across galaxies, though most humans had never met them. The sisters. Each of the sisters moved with purpose. Their identical faces held calm determination, and their eyes seemed to calculate everything at once. The local settlers often whispered about them, in fear and awe. The sisters weren't hunters or fighters in the usual sense. They didn't need guns or weapons. Their strength was in coordination, intellect, and sheer presence. If they decided to enforce a rule, nothing, not armies, not machines, could easily stop them. Jacob watched them approach and felt neither fear nor anger. He had faced storms, wild creatures, and lonely nights that could break lesser men. But these 5, he understood why most would be cautious. He also understood why he was not. The sisters stopped at the edge of the barn, forming a perfect circle around it. They didn't speak at first. Their presence alone was enough to make the wind seem still. Jacob shifted his weight and called out in his calm, low voice. "Evening," he said simply. "I was expecting visitors, but not quite like you." One of the sisters stepped forward. She was indistinguishable from the others, though something in the tilt of her head made her seem a leader. "We are here for the barn," she said. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying authority without anger. "We have reason to believe it contains something you should not possess alone." Jacob chuckled quietly, the sound echoing softly in the empty barnyard. "Something I shouldn't have? Maybe. Something I need? Definitely. But you can't just take it from me, sisters. Not without understanding it." Another sister, stepping slightly closer, tilted her head, studying him. "Understanding is unnecessary. Protocol dictates that no single human should control a system that affects multiple worlds." Jacob didn't argue. He nodded slowly. "Protocol, rules, laws. You've got a lot of those where you come from. But this barn isn't about control. It's about balance. And it only works with one human caring for it properly." The sisters exchanged glances, subtle but precise. It was almost imperceptible, but Jacob knew they communicated like that, an entire conversation in a single blink or tilt of the head. They were not accustomed to human patience, yet somehow, he could sense hesitation. He stepped aside and gestured toward the barn. "Come on in. But I warn you, it won't make sense to you the way you think. You might see structure, logic, calculations, but what you won't see is what keeps it alive." The sisters stepped inside cautiously. Their eyes scanned the interior with the precision of instruments. Yet their movements were careful, restrained, almost curious. Inside, the barn looked ordinary at first glance. Wooden beams, shelves with tools, and a small workbench. Yet Jacob knew that appearances were deceiving. At the back of the barn, a faint glow pulsed from beneath a metal hatch. The glow was gentle, almost like sunlight through morning mist. But it had a rhythm, a life of its own. Jacob crouched and lifted the hatch carefully. Inside was a network of machinery that seemed impossibly complex for a human mind. Yet it was not a machine built to dominate or destroy. It hummed softly, adjusting the environment in subtle ways, regulating airflow, light, and energy in the barn. And somehow, beyond it, the sisters leaned closer. This is what you guard? Asked one, her voice more curious than judgmental. It seems primitive. Jacob smiled, a little wryly. Primitive? Maybe to you. But it works where you wouldn't even think to try. It's simple enough for a human to manage, but complex enough that nothing else can keep it balanced. I've spent years learning its patterns, its moods, and it responds to care, not force. One sister circled the machinery, scanning every panel with precision instruments that hovered silently in the air. We detect subtle energy fluctuations, enough to stabilize a region of space-time. You're telling me a single human can manage this? That's right, Jacob said. He ran a hand along a worn lever. It's not about strength, it's about attention, judgment, and patience. The system reacts to mistakes, adjustments, even emotions. I guess it's alive in its own way, and it prefers a human hand guiding it. The sisters paused. They had never encountered a human system that required so much human inconsistency. Most advanced civilizations replaced uncertainty with precision, eliminating what they called weakness. Yet here was a system that thrived because of it. Jacob stood up straight and looked at them. You see, sisters, being strong isn't about overpowering someone else. Strength is understanding limits, knowing when to act and when to let things flow. This barn, it's not about controlling. It's about balancing, and I'm the one who keeps that balance. The sisters tilted their heads, silent for a moment. Jacob could almost feel their collective minds whirring, debating, calculating. He leaned back against the doorway, relaxed, letting them explore. One sister finally spoke. If what you say is true, then the system cannot survive without you. Yet protocol. She trailed off, her voice uncertain. Protocol does not account for exceptions based on care or patience. Jacob shrugged lightly. Protocol is for beings who trust only rules. Humans, we work with the world, not just against it. Sometimes, the rules don't cover the things that matter most. Another sister, the quietest of the group, knelt near the glow and touched the edge of the hatch. Jacob noticed a flicker in her expression, a subtle sign that she was seeing something she had never expected. It responds to her touch? One asked. Jacob nodded. It responds to anyone who understands it, but very few beings can. Humans. We're stubborn, but patient in ways other species aren't. That's why it chose me. The barn hummed again, almost as if agreeing. The sisters looked at each other. They were powerful, coordinated, and intelligent beyond measure, but none of them had ever faced a system that literally required human unpredictability. Jacob walked toward the door and opened it fully, sunlight spilling across the barn floor. You can stay and watch, if you like. I won't stop you. But remember, strength isn't what you think it is. Sometimes, the smallest hand can hold the greatest responsibility. For a long moment, the sisters remained inside, silent, observing the cowboy and the barn. Outside, the wind carried the scent of dust and wildflowers, and the sun sank lower behind the distant hills. Jacob's horse nickered softly, pawing at the ground, as if it, too, understood the importance of the moment. Finally, one sister spoke again, her tone soft, almost contemplative. Perhaps we underestimated humans, not for their strength, but for their balance. Jacob smiled faintly, tipping his hat. Balance? Yes. That's what keeps worlds turning, sisters. The sun disappeared behind the hills, leaving the barn in the gentle glow of twilight. Jacob knew the sisters would not leave quickly. They would study, debate, and question everything they had ever believed about humans, and that was fine. He had time, the barn had time, humanity had patience, and sometimes, patience was the strongest thing of all. The barn lay quiet under the first stars of evening, its soft hum blending with the whisper of wind through the dry grass outside. Jacob Kane leaned against the old wooden doorframe, arms crossed, watching the sisters move carefully among the shadows and the dim glow from the machinery beneath the hatch. They did not touch the barn recklessly, but their eyes scanned every corner with precision that made Jacob smile. Humans could adapt to chaos, but some beings, no matter how intelligent, were trained to expect control and perfection. One sister finally spoke, her voice low, almost curious. "You claim that strength is irrelevant here. Yet we surround you. You are alone. What prevents you from being overwhelmed by 5 of us?" Jacob chuckled softly, a sound like gravel rolling down a hill. "Overwhelmed? Not a chance. You don't see it yet. But the barn, it chooses its keeper. Strength in numbers won't work here. It's patience, understanding, and timing that matter. The rest, well, the rest is noise." Another sister tilted her head. "We are not noise. We are precise, coordinated. We can anticipate your every move." Jacob's grin widened. "Maybe. But can you anticipate when to wait? When to listen? That's the thing about humans. We see what is coming. Yes, but we also know when to do nothing. Doing nothing is sometimes the strongest act of all." The sisters paused. They had never encountered this human stubbornness mixed with calm clarity. Most beings would have considered force the first option. Humans, Jacob knew, often surprised even the most logical species. One of them, the sister who had been quietest in the barn, crouched by the glowing hatch again, her fingers hovering above the smooth metal surface. "What is this?" she asked softly, almost to herself. "It feels aware." Jacob nodded, walking toward her. "It is. Not in the way you're used to. Most of your systems are designed to think and act perfectly, without error. It thrives on imperfection, on judgment, on subtle decisions that only a human can make." The sister straightened and looked at him. "Judgment? How can a single human make decisions for a system that influences more than one planet?" He laughed, not loudly, but with warmth. "Because it doesn't need a perfect answer. It needs the right choice, at the right time. Not logic, not force. Humans, we improvise. We adapt. That's why it works." Another sister moved closer, circling the glowing hatch slowly. "We were told humans are strong, persistent, and resilient. Yet, your strength seems quiet, fragile almost." Jacob shook his head. "Fragile? Maybe to look at. But strength isn't always loud, or big, or fast. Sometimes, it's about keeping balance while the world tries to push you off course. That's what this barn, and me, do." For a long moment, silence filled the barn. The sisters stood in careful formation, studying both the cowboy and the mysterious glow beneath the hatch. Jacob could feel their thoughts in faint ripples: curiosity, caution, calculation. But more than that, there was something new. Uncertainty. Jacob leaned on the workbench, folding his arms. "Let me show you something. Not everything can be seen with your instruments." He reached to a lever at the side of the machinery. With a gentle pull, the barn shivered slightly, and the glow beneath the hatch shifted colors, moving from soft gold to pale blue. The air itself seemed to ripple, and the sisters instinctively took a step back. "It reacts to touch," Jacob said. "Not just any touch. It reacts to attention, care, and understanding. The moment someone approaches with impatience or arrogance, it resists. Humans, we're stubborn enough to earn its trust." The sisters moved closer again, their heads tilting in unison, as if considering a puzzle. One spoke, more softly this time. "We have never met a system that requires patience. Usually machines require programming, rules, and strict input. This requires intuition." Jacob smiled. "Exactly. That's why it chose me, and why you can't just overwhelm it. Strength isn't in pushing harder, it's in knowing when to step back and let things be." The quiet sister touched the glowing hatch lightly. The light pulsed, soft and warm, as if responding to her curiosity. She withdrew her hand quickly, startled by the sensation. It recognizes attention, she whispered. Jacob nodded slowly. Yes, but it doesn't just recognize attention. It rewards judgment. And humans? We're full of contradictions. That's what it needs. You're too perfect. Too coordinated. You would never make a mistake it could learn from. Another sister tilted her head, almost imperceptibly. So, your flaw is your strength? Jacob shrugged. Something like that. We make mistakes. We improvise. We feel uncertainty. And somehow, that keeps everything balanced. It's a kind of strength you won't understand until you live with it. The sisters exchanged glances. Even in their collective intelligence, they could not fully calculate what Jacob meant. Their systems were designed to optimize, to correct, to remove error. But here was a human whose errors were not weaknesses, they were essential. Jacob walked slowly to the center of the barn, letting them observe him. You surround me, yes. But the barn, it responds to me. Not you. It doesn't care about numbers. It cares about judgment, patience, and subtle timing. You may be coordinated, but you're too synchronized. That's not how balance works. The sisters circled him cautiously, their identical faces showing no emotion. Yet he could feel their curiosity growing. One of them spoke, a note of respect in her tone. We underestimated humans. Not for brute strength, but for subtlety, for patience, for adaptability. Jacob chuckled. Subtlety? Yes. That's how humans survive where others fail. You can predict action, calculate strength, anticipate outcomes. But patience? That's harder. And it's often the strongest thing of all. The quietest sister returned to the glowing hatch. She crouched, touching the surface again with care. This time, the glow shifted in response, moving in gentle waves that seemed almost musical. Jacob smiled. See? It listens. It learns. It trusts those who understand. The sisters stood in silence. The barn hummed softly, its energy pulsing with a rhythm that only someone who had lived with it could fully feel. Jacob knew the sisters were realizing something profound. No force, no collective intelligence, no perfect coordination could replace the human touch. Jacob stepped toward the door again, gesturing outside. You can stay. Observe. Even test it if you like. But you'll find that it doesn't respond to perfection. It responds to patience, attention, and a human's stubborn willingness to care. For the first time, one sister hesitated. She lowered her eyes, almost contemplative. Jacob noticed. You're learning, he said softly. You'll see that strength isn't always in force. Sometimes it's in understanding limits, knowing when to act, and when to let things unfold naturally. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving the barn bathed in twilight. The air smelled of dry grass, warm earth, and faint hints of oil from the machinery. Jacob's horse moved restlessly outside, sensing the unusual calm inside the barn. One sister finally spoke again, her voice quiet, filled with thought. Perhaps, humans are stronger than we thought. Not because we underestimated them, but because we misunderstood the meaning of strength. Jacob smiled faintly. Exactly. Strength isn't always about pushing. Sometimes, it's about guiding. And sometimes, it's about knowing when to step back and let things live their own way. The barn hummed again, a gentle pulse of energy that filled the quiet space. The sisters, for all their intelligence and coordination, were silent now, reflecting, absorbing the lesson. Jacob leaned back against the doorway, watching the stars appear one by one, knowing that this was only the beginning. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of the frontier plains. The sisters stayed inside the barn, studying, learning, testing the limits of human patience and judgment. Jacob knew that in the coming hours, they would question everything they had believed about control, strength, and intelligence, and that was exactly what he wanted. Patience, observation, and understanding that was the human way. And sometimes, the quietest strengths were the ones that changed everything. The barn was quiet, yet alive. Its gentle hum filled every corner, like the steady heartbeat of something ancient and careful. Jacob Kane moved slowly, checking the levers and dials on the machinery beneath the glowing hatch. The sisters had been observing for hours, their identical faces serene, yet focused. Their initial awe had shifted into deliberate examination, as though they were testing both the cowboy and the barn itself. One of the sisters, the quietest of the five, leaned closer to the glowing panels. "We can see the energy fluctuations now," she said softly. "They are precise, controlled, but delicate. If one input were wrong, it could fail." Jacob nodded. "Exactly. That's why it needs a human. Most beings, most machines, try to control by removing error. They push for perfection, but it works because of imperfection. It listens to judgment, not calculation. To understanding, not force." Another sister stepped forward, crossing her arms. "So you claim that your errors are necessary for stability?" she asked. "You are saying that your mistakes keep this system balanced?" Jacob smiled faintly. "Not exactly mistakes. More like subtle adjustments that only a human can notice. The system isn't perfect. It doesn't want to be. It thrives on insight, attention, and choices that aren't purely logical. That's why it chose me, and why it will fail in the hands of anyone else." The sisters exchanged glances. In their collective experience, humans had often been underestimated, but here was proof one man, managing a system far beyond the reach of their advanced calculations, and succeeding where precision alone could not. Jacob crouched and ran a hand over one of the glowing panels. "See this?" he said. "It adjusts the energy flow to surrounding zones. Tiny errors in calculation would throw everything off. Machines could try to fix it, but they wouldn't know when to wait. Humans know when to act and when to let things be. That's what keeps worlds alive." The quiet sister touched the panel again, her fingers trembling slightly. The glow shifted in response, rippling like gentle waves on water. "It responds to care," she whispered. "Not command, not force." Jacob nodded. "Exactly. You're learning. It's subtle, hard to measure, but if you watch closely, you can see it's true. Strength isn't in control here. Strength is in patience, observation, and choosing the right moment." One of the other sisters stepped closer, tilting her head. "And yet, what if one human cannot keep up? What if you falter? Could the system survive your absence?" Jacob shook his head. "No, not fully. That's the limitation of humans. Yes, but it's also our strength. Only a human caretaker can balance it. Because only we can handle unpredictability. The moment someone too perfect takes over, it resists, refuses to function. It needs judgment, not logic. Emotion, not just calculation." The sisters were silent for a moment. Their collective minds buzzed with calculations, probabilities, and theories. They had never encountered a system that relied on what they might consider a weakness, human imperfection, for its survival. And yet, the evidence was clear. Jacob stood and walked to the doorway, brushing dust from his coat. "You see, sisters, you think strength is about force, speed, or coordination. But here, it's about understanding limits, knowing what to act on, and what to leave alone. Humans are stubborn, yes, but stubbornness is sometimes the strongest force of all." One sister finally asked, curiosity breaking her usual calm tone. "Can you show us more? Can we understand why this system cannot function without you?" Jacob nodded, gesturing toward the glowing hatch. "Of course. But it's not just about observation. You have to interact with it carefully, not mechanically. Let it respond to you. Watch. But don't force. This is the part most beings fail to understand. The sisters positioned themselves carefully around the hatch. Jacob watched, waiting, knowing that even the smallest movement of theirs could disrupt the balance if done incorrectly. He moved closer to guide them without touching. Notice the patterns, he said. See how the glow shifts? It changes not when you touch, but when you understand. Let your attention be steady. Do not command it. Do not predict it. Only notice. The quiet sister leaned forward again, focusing on the glow. Slowly, she began to mimic his subtle gestures, her hands hovering just above the panels without pressing. The light pulsed softly in response, as if recognizing the care in her attention. Jacob smiled. Good. That's what I mean. The barn does not obey force. It responds to insight. Only humans have the right mix of patience, intuition, and adaptability to guide it. Your systems, your collective intelligence, too perfect, too coordinated. It would fail under your hands. Another sister tilted her head. So, the very thing that makes humans limited is what allows you to succeed? Jacob nodded. Yes. Humans have limits. We are fallible. We feel, we err, we improvise. Machines and highly coordinated beings like you avoid error at all costs. But this system, it thrives on judgment, subtle adjustments, and even tiny mistakes. That's why it works with me, and why it wouldn't work with anyone else. The sisters were quiet again, their thoughts heavy. For the first time, they faced a situation where their collective precision and strength were not enough. A human's unpredictability, the very thing they might have dismissed as weakness, was essential. Jacob walked to the center of the barn and gestured to the glow. I know it seems strange. You're used to control, coordination, and perfection. Here, those things are liabilities. A human caretaker brings balance because we can handle chaos. We can make judgment calls, feel the rhythms, and adapt. That's the limitation. And the strength. The quiet sister touched the edge of the hatch lightly. The glow responded, rippling gently as if in recognition. It recognizes intention, she said softly. Not force, not calculation. Intention, Jacob nodded. Exactly. You can see it now. The barn listens to intention, attention, and understanding. Not rules, not orders, not brute strength. That's why I am here. The other sisters moved closer, observing the subtle patterns of the glow. Jacob watched them carefully, knowing that their minds were processing far more than words could convey. They had never encountered a human system that relied on imperfection for survival. Jacob spoke again, calmly. You surround me. Yes. You coordinate, calculate, predict. But none of that matters here. Only judgment, patience, and care matter. You may be stronger together than I am alone, but here, I am the one it chose. One sister finally spoke, her tone softer than before. Perhaps we misjudged humans. Not because we underestimated physical strength, but because we misunderstood what it means to be strong. Jacob smiled faintly. Strength isn't always about force. Sometimes, it's about knowing limits, watching, waiting, and making subtle choices that no one else can see. That's what humans do best. That's why this barn survives. And why you cannot take it by force, or logic, or coordination. The barn hummed gently, the light from the hatch rippling softly. Outside, the wind moved across the plains, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass. The sisters stayed inside, observing, learning, testing their own understanding. Jacob knew that by morning, they would begin to question not just the barn, but everything they believed about control, strength, and intelligence. And that was the lesson he wanted them to learn. Humans were limited, yes, But their limits were also their greatest strength. They could balance, adapt, and care in ways no machine or coordinated collective could. And in that quiet understanding, worlds could survive. Jacob looked at the sisters one last time, leaning against the doorway. Strength isn't in dominating or controlling. It's in understanding, adapting, and caring. Sometimes the quietest strengths are the ones that change everything. The sisters were silent, studying the barn, the glow, and Jacob himself. The quietest among them touched the panel lightly one more time. The glow shifted, responding not to calculation or force, but to human attention. Jacob smiled faintly. See? You can watch, learn, even interact. But remember, this barn chooses. It doesn't obey orders. Only humans can guide it. Because only we can handle what is uncertain, unpredictable, and alive. Outside, the first hints of night fully enveloped the plains. Stars twinkled faintly in the sky, reflecting in the quiet hum of the barn. Jacob's horse nickered softly. Sensing the unusual calm, the sisters remained inside, silent, reflecting on the lesson of human limitation and human strength. And for the first time, they understood that some strengths could not be measured by force, precision, or numbers. Some strengths were quiet, subtle, and uniquely human, and those strengths could change everything. The barn's hum filled the night, a steady pulse that seemed almost alive. Jacob Kane leaned against the wooden beam, observing the sisters as they moved carefully through the space. Their identical faces showed the calm focus of beings who had faced countless challenges across the stars. Yet tonight, there was something different. Something subtle, but unmistakable. The quietest sister, crouched near the glowing hatch, lifted her hand slightly. The barn pulsed softly in response, rippling like water disturbed by a gentle breeze. She withdrew her hand and looked at Jacob. It responds differently to each of us, she said. I can feel it adjusting. Not to our touch, but to our thought, our presence. Jacob nodded. Exactly. You're beginning to notice the truth. This isn't just a system. It's alive in its own way. And it's tuned to a human's touch, a human's judgment. That's why it works with me, and why it won't work with any of you, not even together. Another sister stepped closer, her arms crossed. Yet we are stronger together than you alone. Our coordination, our shared minds. It should give us an advantage, Jacob smiled faintly. It would in most cases. But this barn, it doesn't respond to strength in numbers. It responds to insight, attention, and subtle decision-making. Coordination without judgment? That's not strength here. That's interference. The sisters paused, exchanging subtle glances. Even in their collective intelligence, they could feel the pull of the barn, the gentle insistence of its rhythm. Jacob knew this moment would test them more than anything they had faced in their collective existence. He walked slowly toward the center of the barn. You're coordinated, yes, but you lack unpredictability. You lack patience in the way humans have it. And that's exactly what this barn requires. You can observe, test, even imitate, but you cannot replace the human touch. The quiet sister reached out again, hesitating before her hand hovered over the glowing hatch. But we can learn, she said softly. We can adjust our approach. Jacob shook his head gently. Learning isn't enough. It's not just technique. This system responds to the human ability to adapt without overthinking, to balance without calculation, to act with both caution and intuition. You're too precise, too deliberate. That precision, it's stopping you from understanding it fully. One of the sisters stepped closer, tilting her head as if weighing his words. Are you saying that imperfection is required? Jacob nodded. Yes. Not for weakness, but for balance. Humans are fallible. Yes, but that fallibility allows judgment. Machines, collectives, coordinated minds, they remove error, and in doing so, they remove the system's ability to adapt. Balance cannot exist in perfection. The sisters moved as one, closing in on him and the hatch. Jacob watched carefully. He could feel the energy of the barn shifting slightly under their combined presence, pulsing in a rhythm that seemed almost conscious. Their coordination, usually flawless, began to falter as they tried to match the subtle requirements of the system. Jacob raised a hand, not to stop them, but to observe. "Notice that?" he said quietly. "The closer you get, the more the system resists. It's not aggression, it's feedback. It's telling you that you cannot force it. You must adapt, not dominate." The sisters paused, their identical faces showing the first hint of hesitation. For all their intelligence, they were realizing that some things could not be calculated or predicted. This was a system that required something they could not provide: the unpredictable, patient judgment of a single human. Jacob leaned against the doorway, relaxed, his eyes calm. "Step back, watch, observe, learn, but don't push. You've been closing in, trying to control. That's natural for you. But control won't work here. Balance requires restraint. It requires understanding limits, knowing when to act, and when to let things happen on their own." The quiet sister stepped back, her gaze fixed on the glowing hatch. "So, we are limited. Even together, we cannot reach the same understanding you have." Jacob nodded. "Exactly. Your coordination is remarkable. Your intelligence is beyond most beings. But this system isn't about intelligence alone. It's about insight, subtle judgment, and care. Only humans can provide that. You can observe, but you cannot replace it." Another sister tilted her head, a thoughtful expression crossing her face. "So the very thing we considered a weakness, your humanity, is the reason this system functions?" Jacob smiled. "Yes. Humans are limited. Yes. But those limitations allow us to balance, adapt, and care in ways others cannot. That's why this barn works. That's why it chose me. And that's why it will survive." The sisters remained silent, their thoughts quietly shifting. Jacob could feel the subtle change in their coordination. For the first time, they were questioning their own perfection, their reliance on calculation, their need for control. The barn's influence was gentle but firm, guiding them to an understanding they could not reach through intellect alone. Jacob walked slowly around the glowing hatch, observing their reactions. "You see, patience isn't passive," he said. "It's active. It's knowing when to move and when to wait. You've been closing in, trying to impose control. Now you're stepping back, and that's when understanding begins." The quiet sister reached out again, this time with a calm, deliberate gesture. The glow responded instantly, rippling gently under her hand. Jacob watched carefully, nodding. "Good. That's it. Not force, not calculation. Care. Attention. Subtlety. That's what keeps the system alive." Another sister stepped forward, her tone reflective. "We have never encountered a system that rejects perfection and responds to patience." Jacob nodded. "Most systems are built for control. This one, it thrives on understanding, insight, and human judgment. You may coordinate flawlessly, but that cannot replace adaptability born of limitation, of imperfection, of care." The sisters studied him, studying the barn, and for the first time, their collective unity faltered. Their perfect coordination could not compensate for the unpredictability the system required. Jacob watched with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the lesson was sinking in. He walked to the doorway again, letting the moonlight spill across the floor. "Sometimes," he said softly, "strength isn't in moving faster or calculating more. Sometimes strength is in stepping back, watching, and allowing the world to respond. Humans, we excel at that. That's why the barn survives. That's why I am here." The quiet sister touched the hatch once more, her movements slow and deliberate. The glow pulsed in response, shifting in colors that danced like water in the moonlight. Jacob nodded. See? It listens. It adapts. It responds not to force, not to perfection, but to attention, patience, and care. That's strength. That's balance. The other sisters moved closer, observing, reflecting. Their collective intelligence, so often flawless, was being challenged in a way they had never faced. Jacob knew that by morning, they would have a new understanding of human capability, not just physical strength, not just intellect, but the subtle power of patience, adaptability, and care. Jacob leaned back against the doorway, relaxed, his eyes on the glow of the hatch. Step back, sisters. Observe, learn. But do not try to dominate. Balance is not about control. It's about understanding limits, making subtle choices, and knowing when to act. The sisters remained silent, absorbing the lesson. The barn pulsed softly, alive in a way that could not be calculated, predicted, or controlled. Jacob smiled faintly, knowing that they were learning the most important truth, that some strengths, quiet and subtle, were uniquely human, and those strengths could change everything. Outside, the wind swept across the plains, carrying the scent of earth and grass. The horse moved softly nearby, sensing the calm energy of the barn. The sisters stayed inside, silent, thoughtful. Their coordinated movements less precise, less perfect, yet more aware. Jacob's voice broke the quiet. Soft but firm. You can surround me, coordinate, calculate, but some things cannot be replicated. Some strengths cannot be measured. Humans are limited, yes, but those limits are what make us capable of keeping balance where others fail. That's what you're learning now. The quiet sister touched the panel one last time. The glow shifted gently, recognizing care, attention, and patience. Jacob nodded. Good, that's enough for tonight. You'll continue to learn, reflect, and understand. But remember, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's quiet, subtle, uniquely human. The sisters stepped back, their minds processing, questioning, and adapting. For the first time, they were experiencing a system they could not dominate, a system they could only respect. Jacob knew that the lessons of the night would stay with them, quietly reshaping their understanding of strength, balance, and the human touch. And the barn continued to hum, its light pulsing gently, alive and balanced, guided by a single human who understood the subtle art of patience, care, and quiet strength. The first light of dawn crept over the frontier plains, casting soft golden hues across the barn and the dusty fields. Inside, the barn pulsed gently, its glow ebbing and flowing like a living heartbeat. Jacob Kane stood near the hatch, brushing dust from his coat, his eyes calm and steady. The sisters had remained through the night, silent, thoughtful, and quietly learning the lessons of human limitation and strength. The quietest sister, crouched near the glowing machinery, finally spoke. We have studied. We have observed. And yet, we cannot replicate what you do. Not together. Not with our combined intelligence. Only a human can guide this system. Jacob nodded, his faint smile growing. Exactly. It isn't about force, numbers, or precision. It's about attention, care, and subtle judgment. This barn responds to understanding, not calculation. And that's why it chose me, and why it will survive. One of the other sisters stepped forward, her voice calm but tinged with awe. We have never encountered a human who could manage a system like this. Usually, humans try to control or dominate. But you understand balance. You guide, not impose. That is the strength we underestimated. Jacob shrugged lightly. Most humans don't see it that way. We're stubborn, yes, and sometimes slow to learn, but that stubbornness is part of the gift. It allows us to notice what others cannot, to act when necessary, and to wait when patience is required. The sisters exchanged subtle glances. For the first time, their collective unity showed hesitation. Their perfectly coordinated minds had never faltered. Yet here, they were unable to surpass the insight of a single human being. Jacob could see it in the way they observed, in the tiny, almost imperceptible pauses in their calculations. The quiet sister rose and stepped back, her eyes fixed on the glowing hatch. We understand now. This system cannot function under perfect coordination. It requires imperfection, human judgment, and subtle care. It thrives on what we once thought of as weakness. Jacob nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction. Yes. Imperfection is not weakness here. It is the foundation of balance. Strength isn't always loud or forceful. Sometimes it's quiet, patient, and subtle. That's what humans excel at. That's why the barn survives. Another sister tilted her head thoughtfully. So, your limitations are what give you the ability to maintain this system? Jacob smiled. Exactly. Limits, fallibility, patience, all of it. Humans can adapt, improvise, and care in ways that no perfect system, no collective mind, and no machine can match. The barn isn't just machinery, it's alive in a sense. And it listens only to the human touch, the judgment, the subtle decisions we make every day. The sisters stepped closer again. But not to test or dominate. This time, there was respect in their movements. Jacob could sense the shift. Their minds, usually so precise and calculated, were quieting, observing the nuances that only a human could notice. You have proven. Humans are unique, one said softly. Not for strength, but for balance, for adaptability, for patience, for the ability to guide, rather than dominate. Jacob nodded slowly. Yes, that's the truth. Humans survive not because we are strongest or fastest, but because we understand limits, improvise, and care. The barn chose me because it knew only a human could handle it, and now you know why. The quiet sister reached out once more to the glowing hatch, her touch deliberate and gentle. The light pulsed softly, responding not to calculation or perfection, but to human-like attention. Jacob watched, letting her experience it fully. One of the other sisters spoke again, her tone thoughtful. We have seen it now. The system cannot be replaced by perfection. It cannot be controlled by strength alone. It requires insight, care, and the subtle judgment that only humans provide. We accept that, Jacob nodded. Good. You don't have to act on it immediately. Just remember it. Humans are capable of quiet, subtle victories. Sometimes the smallest hand, the quietest action, can balance entire systems. That's what the barn represents. That's what we represent. The sisters remained silent, absorbing the lesson. Jacob could feel the subtle change in their collective minds. They were still intelligent, still precise, but now tempered with humility and understanding. They had encountered a human system that could not be dominated, only respected and cared for. Outside, the plains glowed with the soft light of morning. Jacob's horse moved gently, sensing the calm energy of the barn. The sisters stepped outside for a moment, their identical faces reflecting quiet contemplation. Jacob remained by the doorway, watching them with a faint smile. Today, he said softly, you've learned something important. Humans may seem limited, fallible, or stubborn, but our limitations allow us to do what others cannot. Strength is not always force, and intelligence is not always insight. Sometimes, the quietest strengths are the ones that change everything. The quiet sister nodded. We will leave now, she said. But the understanding remains. This barn, this human, cannot be replaced. We recognize your role. We recognize the system's dependence on human care. Jacob tipped his hat slightly, his smile gentle. Good, that's all I ever wanted. The barn survives because it has the right caretaker. And the lesson survives because you've learned it. Humans do not dominate by force, we endure by understanding, adapting, and caring. The sisters turned and walked toward the plains, their identical forms moving in harmony, but with a new sense of awareness. Jacob watched them leave, knowing they would carry this lesson with them to worlds far beyond this one. The barn continued to hum softly, alive and balanced, a testament to patience, insight, and the quiet strength of humanity. Jacob walked to the center of the barn, kneeling to adjust a subtle control. The glow shifted gently, responding to his attention, a living proof of what he had explained to the sisters. The barn was stable, harmonious, and alive, not because it was controlled, but because it was understood. He stood and walked to the doorway again, looking out across the plains. The sun rose higher, casting long golden shadows, painting the world in warmth. Jacob knew the sisters would not forget what they had learned tonight. He also knew that the barn, under his care, would continue to function as it always had, alive, balanced, and safe. Strength, he whispered to himself, is quiet. It is subtle. It is human. The morning breeze stirred, carrying the scent of dry grass and fresh earth into the barn. Jacob's horse nickered softly, pawing at the ground. The barn pulsed gently, a living heartbeat of energy and care. Jacob leaned against the doorway, relaxed and calm, watching the plains stretch to the horizon. The sisters were gone now, but their presence lingered, a reminder that even beings of immense intelligence and coordination could recognize the value of patience, insight, and the human touch. For a long while, Jacob simply stood there, listening to the barn's hum and feeling the quiet power of balance and understanding. It was a victory that required no conflict, no force, and no domination. It was a victory of insight, patience, and quiet human strength, and that was enough. The barn glowed softly as the day began in earnest. Jacob knew that no matter what came next, the system would endure. Guided by human care and subtle judgment, the sisters had come, observed, and learned. Humanity had proven itself once again not by dominating, but by understanding, adapting, and sustaining life where others could not. And in that quiet truth, Jacob Kane smiled, tipping his hat to the rising sun. The barn's hum filled the morning air, steady, alive, and unbroken, a testament to the quiet, enduring strength of a single human who understood balance, patience, and the power of care. The frontier world stretched out before him, vast, untamed, and full of possibility. And Jacob knew that with understanding, attention, and subtle human strength, there were no limits to what could be balanced, guided, or protected. The barn continued to hum softly, alive in its own way. Jacob watched the plains stretch toward the horizon, confident in a truth that the sisters now understood. Sometimes, the quietest strengths are the ones that endure, and those strengths are uniquely human.